Is NATO on the brink of collapse? This question sent shockwaves all throughout the West ever since Trump's first term. And now, with the second term amplifying the chaos, the stakes are even higher. Pardons for controversial figures, a radical economic agenda, rising political hostilities between the US and its allies, the foundation of Western unity held together by NATO is cracking more than ever before. So will the alliance that once held the world together withstand Trump's second term? Or is its downfall inevitable? And perhaps the most chilling question of them all, is NATO even worth saving anymore? The question of US's subsistence and possible exile from the alliance isn't a new topic. It has already been proposed by Trump 7 years ago, in 2018. At that time, Trump threatened to leave the organization under the excuse that the US has been pulling most of the weight. He argued that the US has far more pressing internal issues to work on instead of focusing on other countries' problems, as at the time, the US economy and industry was in total disrepair. According to him, America has been financially burdened by NATO due to an unequal distribution of GDP towards defense compared to the US, thus not allowing the US to focus its funds on its own difficulties. This stance led to his constant conflicts with France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Angela Merkel, further straining the diplomatic relations between his allies. And now, in his early second presidency, Trump has done nothing but antagonize the US's allies even further. Bringing tariffs to Canada, creating a conflict zone with Denmark around Greenland, and through Elon Musk, promising to fund right-wing parties all throughout Europe. Trump isn't stopping. It's unquestionable that he, as of now, isn't working towards the greater good of NATO, but enforcing his own totalitarian will over his allies, practically forcing them to either stand with him or be left to the wolves. He's trying to bully them into submission, which is natural since the US is essentially the most important link of the entire alliance, but it's also very selfish and short-sighted. But Trump's presidency isn't the only reason NATO is at risk. The alliance has been crumbling and rotting away from within for years, and this is just the straw that might break the camel's back. Despite Europe blaming the US for the current state of NATO, the Old World Alliance members were also not short to grow mutual resentment towards one another in the past decade. Many internal EU and NATO conflicts have taken place recently and have thoroughly shaken the entire alliance to its core. For example, the bickering between Greece and Cyprus was one of the first bigger conflicts, and it has opened a real Pandora's box for territorial and diplomatic disputes amongst members. However, the biggest affront and what could be described as the biggest crisis of the alliance was the AUKUS agreement. The internal alliance between Australia, UK, and the US created a clan inside of the organization and resulted in France, a close ally and industrial and economic partner of Australia, being excluded from many future ventures, most notably a $66 billion submarine contract. Furthermore, it practically separated these three countries as higher priority members compared to the rest when it comes down to the Indo-Pacific security strategy, and thus showed how easy it is for NATO members to stab each other in their backs. The rift was so big that France recalled its ambassadors and officials from both Australia and the US and severely cooled down its relations with all three subparties of the AUKUS agreement. But this was just the start of it, as what came a year later in 2022 would leave NATO scarred forever. For 3 years, Ukraine has been ravaged by war. One reason? NATO's involvement and its constant agitation of Russia. What started as political maneuvering escalated into full-blown conflict. And this conflict then brought internal tensions and general civil and political unrest amongst nations, and showed how dependent European NATO members were on a global scale, and how easy they were to sway and manipulate by just cutting off their resource supply lines. This further ravaged the unity between various European NATO members, with some starting to subtly push towards Russia due to the ensuing economic hardships, and others being pressed even harder on cutting all ties with the East, creating an internal rift between various members. And apart from political differences between nations, what also started rising were the people. As you might have noticed, regular people in Europe started rebelling against their governments both silently and violently, and protesting their political decisions, creating a rift between what the people want and what the politicians are actually fighting for. The US, on the other hand, was fulfilling its own agenda at this point, doing what was necessary for their own economic growth and political influence on Europe's soil through Ukraine. However, this push wasn't that severe, as the US had enough internal problems already not to prioritize the expansion of their influence on Europe. However, Trump will do just that. He will expand. And he will use the Ukrainian war and the collective civil unrest to install his own people and fund his own ideas, which, in the oncoming chaos, will catch people's attention, especially with conservatism on the rise globally, and especially in Europe. So, what can NATO do? Ironically enough, even though Trump might seem like NATO's undoing, like the final nail in an already dilapidated coffin, he might actually drive its resurrection too. In fact, the US might be the perfect middle ground between Russia and Europe, due to Trump's close relations with Putin and Russia, and the US's current position as the de facto leader of NATO. Russia is also in a terrible position currently, and the ongoing Ukraine conflict has resulted in it being strung thin. Virtually all of its trade relations with Europe have been severed, and it has lost its primary influence in BRICS to China, which is rapidly gaining the upper hand as the greatest force in the world. Therefore, Trump's presidency, due to his close ties with the Bear of the East, might actually be a bridge between the two sides, as his urging and pushing for establishing trade and political relationships will definitely be beneficial for both sides. Russia and NATO have a great potential of becoming, if not allies, then at least acquaintances in the future, but that's something that both sides need to work on. But NATO first has to survive and resist America's and Trump's aggressive bully policies and ideas that threaten the territorial integrity of NATO's members. Either that, or cave in and allow the US to create a literal satellite out of them by using Europe's current unrest for creating their own political parties on the soil. Which makes us wonder, will it stand? Will NATO survive Trump's second presidency? Most likely yes. In fact, if a dialogue between the US and the rest of the alliance is made, and if the two parties finally understand that instead of standing in place, which is what NATO has been doing for the better part of the century, evolving is the only answer, NATO might come out stronger than ever. But those are a lot of ifs, and a lot of them need time to be properly resolved. Time, which isn't on NATO's side. With BRICS on the rise and with their influence starting to show its head onto the European soil through various non-EU countries like Serbia, as well as some European giants like Hungary, NATO will have to work fast and effective if they expect to survive. In addition to that, as we established previously, the US aren't doing anything to make it easy on the rest of NATO and keep tensions low. Trump is, with every given day, acting seemingly more and more erratic, and instead of creating less tension between the US and the rest of the world, like he initially tried to do in his first term, he's done everything in his power to burn all the bridges behind him and the US. NATO is thus in a real sandwich between the East and the West, and if the members want to survive, they will have to lower the ball on both sides and start working towards establishing good relations between the two. More importantly, they will have to work on creating a proper unity on European soil primarily, as only that will allow them to survive the hard times that await us. In the end, nothing more can be said, nothing more is left but a quote written more than a century ago by the great Lord Alfred Tennyson, which best describes the North Atlantic Treaty Organization today. We are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.